Somewhere in the Ardennes forest, late December 1944, a Wehrmacht battalion commander crouched in a makeshift command post carved into frozen earth. For 3 days, his men had been holding a defensive line against American forces, pushing east from the Meuse River. The fighting had been brutal, but manageable. German 88mm guns had knocked out several Sherman tanks. Machine gun nests had broken up infantry assaults. This was the kind of tactical defense German officers had perfected across 5 years of war. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Then the sound started, not the familiar crack of American 105mm howitzers, which his men had learned to respect but could survive in their dugouts. This was different, a freight train roar that seemed to tear the sky itself. Shells began impacting behind his forward positions, then at the positions themselves, then systematically across every grid square where German troops had dug in. The commander checked his watch, calculating. American artillery doctrine called for brief preparatory fires before an assault. 5 minutes, maybe 10. His men would weather the storm, then meet the infantry attack with rifle and machine gun fire. But the shells kept coming. 10 minutes became 20, 20 became 30. The barrage didn't stop. It didn't even slow down, and the impact pattern told a story that made his stomach tighten. These weren't the shorter-range divisional guns firing from forward positions. These rounds were coming from miles beyond where he'd plotted American artillery positions. His forward observers had calculated the maximum range envelope based on captured intelligence reports. The shells now eviscerating his battalion were landing from positions that shouldn't exist. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. When the barrage finally lifted after 45 minutes, the commander emerged to find his battalion effectively destroyed as a fighting force. 3 companies had ceased to exist as coherent units. His communications network was shredded. The carefully prepared defensive positions that had taken 3 days to dig were now overlapping craters. And the American infantry hadn't even started their assault yet. This was just preparation fires. He would learn later, through prisoner interrogation reports, what had hit his position. 155mm guns, Model 1. Americans called them Long Toms, but the intelligence reports he'd studied back in training had gotten the numbers wrong. They'd described American corps-level artillery as adequate, but nothing revolutionary. Maximum range around 13,000 meters, comparable to German weapons. The shells that had just obliterated his battalion had come from positions 19,000 meters away, more than 11 miles. The intelligence wasn't just wrong, it was catastrophically wrong. And across the Western Front in late 1944, German commanders were learning the same terrible lesson. The Americans had brought artillery that operated on a different scale than anything German doctrine had prepared for. This is not a story about incremental technological advantage. This is about a weapon system that fundamentally rewrote the rules of ground combat. The 155mm Long Tom represented something German artillery could not match, could not counter, and ultimately could not survive against. To understand why requires going back to where this weapon came from, and why the Wehrmacht never saw it coming. Before entering World War I, the United States was poorly equipped with heavy artillery. The Army's heaviest field piece was a 3-inch howitzer. When American doughboys arrived in France in 1917, they inherited artillery from their French allies. One of these inherited weapons was the Canon de 155mm Grande Puissance Filou, the GPF. Grande Puissance meant great power. The name was earned. This gun could hurl a 95-pound shell over 17,000 yards. American artillery officers respected the French GPF, but they recognized its limitations. The design was robust, but it reflected World War I thinking. Heavy, slow to emplace, difficult to move. After the war ended, the US Army began development work on a replacement. The goal was to improve on the GPF while incorporating lessons learned from 4 years of industrial warfare. But then, the Great Depression arrived. Military budgets collapsed. Prototype development continued at a glacial pace throughout the 1920s and 1930s, but full production funding simply didn't exist. The development team at Rock Island Arsenal and other facilities kept working. They designed a completely new split-trail carriage. The two-prototype carriage featured an 8-wheel integral 2-axle bogie for high-speed towing. The design was revolutionary for American artillery. All-welded construction, roll-bearing suspension, the ability to traverse 60 degrees without moving the entire weapon. The prototype barrel measured 22 feet and 10.7 inches, not counting the breech, designated T4. It could fire a 95-pound projectile over 26,000 yards. This wasn't incremental improvement over the French GPF. This was a weapon designed from scratch for mobile warfare. In July 1940, with war spreading across Europe, the gun was officially standardized as the 155mm gun Monet on carriage Moan. Production began immediately, but quantities remained limited. Only 20 Monet guns existed when production switched to the improved M1A1 variant in June 1941. The M1A1 featured a modified breech ring. Otherwise, it was mechanically identical. American troops began calling it the Long Tom. The nickname had historical roots in American artillery going back to the 19th century, but it fit. That extended barrel gave the weapon an unmistakable profile. The gun's specifications read like a wish list of capabilities that artillery designers had struggled to combine. Total weight in firing position was 30,600 pounds. Length in transport configuration approached 45 feet. The barrel had a 45 caliber length, meaning the tube measured 45 times the 155mm bore diameter. This length translated directly into muzzle velocity. The Long Tom could propel its projectile at over 800 meters per second. Maximum range with supercharged propellant was 23,700 meters. In practical terms, shells could reach targets 14.7 miles away. But raw range numbers don't capture what made this weapon revolutionary. The German 5cm Schwerfeldhaubitze 18, the SFH-18, was Germany's standard division-level heavy howitzer. It fired a nearly identical 96-pound shell. Maximum range was 13,250 meters. The German gun could reach targets 8.2 miles distant. The Long Tom could engage targets almost 7 miles further out. This range disparity had profound tactical implications. German artillery doctrine in 1944 still reflected World War I principles. Artillery provided fire support for infantry and armor. Batteries positioned themselves within range of expected engagement areas. Forward observers called for fire. Shells impacted. Infantry advanced. This doctrine assumed both sides' artillery had roughly comparable range envelopes. German gunners could expect to receive counter-battery fire from enemy artillery positioned at similar distances. American artillery doctrine had evolved differently. The revolution began at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, in the 1930s. Under Carlos Brewer's leadership, artillery officers developed the firing chart system. This innovation allowed multiple batteries, sometimes dozens of guns scattered across miles of front, to coordinate their fires with scientific precision. Each battery surveyed its exact position. Target coordinates were transmitted to a fire direction center. Calculations accounted for barrel wear, meteorological conditions, propellant temperature, dozens of variables. When the command came, every gun fired at precisely calculated intervals, so all shells arrived at the target within a 3-second window. This technique, called time on target, represented systematic excellence applied to indirect fire, but it required guns with sufficient range to mass fires from dispersed positions. The Long Tom was designed explicitly to enable this doctrine. Its extended range meant batteries could position far behind the front lines, protected from German counter-battery fire, while still engaging targets across the entire tactical depth of the battlefield. A German battalion commander plotting defensive fires in late 1944 faced a mathematical nightmare. His own artillery, the SFH-18, could reach targets 13,000 meters out. American Long Toms positioned 20,000 meters behind their front lines could hit his positions with impunity. His artillery couldn't shoot back. They weren't in range. The Long Tom saw combat for the first time in North Africa on December 24, 1942. Battery A of the 36th Field Artillery Regiment deployed its guns against German positions. American artillery officers quickly recognized they possessed a decisive advantage. German artillery could be outranged, suppressed, and systematically destroyed without ever closing to where German guns could return effective fire. Eventually, 33 U.S. Army Corps-level artillery battalions in the European and Mediterranean theaters were equipped with Long Toms. Each battalion typically operated 12 guns. These battalions were not attached to divisions. They were Corps-level assets, deployed where senior commanders needed them most. The Pacific Theater received 8 Long Tom battalions. Even in jungle terrain where range seemed less critical, American commanders valued the weapon's ability to reach inland targets from coastal positions. The Long Tom was usually towed by the M4 high-speed tractor, a tracked vehicle that could move the heavy gun across difficult terrain at speeds up to 35 miles per hour on roads. The gun could also be towed by heavy trucks, though the M4 became standard by 1943. Each gun required a crew of 14 to 15 men to operate effectively. In sustained fire, a well-trained crew could maintain 1 round per minute indefinitely. This rate sounds modest compared to lighter artillery. But the Long Tom wasn't designed for rapid fire. It was designed for reach, accuracy, and destructive power at distances where enemy artillery couldn't respond. The ammunition supply system reflected American industrial capacity: separate, loading, bagged charge ammunition. The projectile and propellant charges were packaged separately. Crew members loaded the shell into the breech, then added the appropriate number of powder bags depending on range to target. The base charge weighed 9.23 kilograms. Increment charges added 4.69 kilograms each. For maximum range, both base and increment charges were used, the combination called supercharge. The M21 4-ton two-wheel ammunition trailer could carry 72 rounds plus propellant charges. This trailer became standard equipment for Long Tom units. Later in the war, the M23 8-ton four-wheel trailer entered service, capable of carrying 96 rounds plus charges. German artillery units by 1944 were rationed to 10 or 20 rounds per gun per day due to ammunition shortages. American Long Tom batteries had no such restrictions. Ammunition arrived in continuous streams from Corps-level supply dumps. American logistics could sustain fire missions that German planners considered wasteful. But when ammunition is plentiful and industrial capacity unlimited, volume of fire becomes its own tactical doctrine. The weapon's accuracy was remarkable. Estimated accuracy life was 1,500 rounds. This meant the barrel maintained precision for 1,500 firings before wear degraded accuracy enough to require replacement. In practice, barrels often lasted longer, but 1,500 rounds represented the Army's quality standard. For comparison, 1,500 rounds equals 1,500 missions where each shell landed where it was supposed to land. In practical battlefield terms, that's months of sustained combat operations. The Long Tom fired several shell types. High explosive was standard. The projectile contained enough explosive to create a lethal radius of 30 yards and cause casualties at 500 yards on flat, open terrain. Armor-piercing capped shells existed for use against fortifications, smoke shells for screening operations, chemical shells, though these were rarely used, illumination rounds for nighttime operations. Each shell type had specific tactical applications, but high explosive remained the most common. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. The German Army's encounter with American Long Tom artillery began gradually, then became overwhelming. In North Africa, German commanders noted American artillery's longer reach, but attributed it to favorable positioning. In Sicily and Italy, the pattern became clearer. American corps, artillery could engage German positions from ranges that made counter-battery fire impossible. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy in June 1944, Wehrmacht artillery officers understood they faced a systemic problem. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, one of Germany's most tactically astute commanders, recognized American artillery superiority early. In a letter dated February 18, 1943, he described fighting around Kasserine Pass. An observation plane, he noted, directed the fire of numerous batteries on all worthwhile targets throughout the zone. This integration of aerial observation with rapid coordinated fires from multiple batteries represented capabilities German artillery had not achieved. Rommel was observing the Fort Sill doctrine in action: time on target fires, multiple batteries converging shells on a single point, systematic destruction delivered with industrial precision. During the Italian campaign, Rommel's assessment became more pointed. The enemy's tremendous superiority in artillery, and even more in the air, had broken the front open, he wrote. By the Normandy campaign, his conclusions had crystallized. Great superiority in artillery and outstandingly large supply of ammunition. These were not complaints about temporary disadvantage. These were professional acknowledgments from one of Germany's finest commanders that American artillery had achieved something Germany could not match. The technical comparison between German and American heavy artillery reveals the scope of this disparity. The 15-centimeter SFH-18 was Germany's workhorse heavy howitzer. Designed in the late 1920s and early 1930s, it reflected Krupp engineering excellence. The weapon was robust, reliable, and accurate. It fired a 43.5 kilogram shell to a maximum range of 13,250 meters under optimal conditions. In practice, this range was limited to 9,725 meters, because the final two propellant charges caused excessive barrel erosion. German artillery doctrine emphasized these last two charges could only be used in emergency situations with field commander authorization. No more than 10 rounds could be fired consecutively with maximum charges, and their use had to be recorded. This constraint reflected German concerns about barrel life and maintenance. The SFH-18's rate of fire was approximately 4 rounds per minute, with an experienced crew under ideal conditions. But ideal conditions rarely existed by 1944. Crew fatigue, inexperienced replacements, ammunition shortages, and constant Allied air harassment meant real-world rates often dropped below 2 rounds per minute. The Long Tom, by contrast, operated under no such restrictions. American crews fired maximum range charges routinely. Barrel replacement was a maintenance issue, not a tactical constraint. The American industrial base could produce replacement barrels faster than combat operations wore them out. This seemingly mundane logistical detail had profound battlefield implications. German artillery officers had to husband their weapons, calculating each shot against barrel life and ammunition availability. American artillery officers simply fired when targets presented themselves. By late 1944, Wehrmacht artillery units faced another crippling disadvantage: mobility, or rather, the lack of it. The SFH-18 was designed for horse towing. The carriage used an unsprung axle and hard rubber tires. A two-wheel bogie was introduced to allow vehicle towing, but the lack of suspension made high-speed movement impossible. German artillery moved slowly, positioned slowly, and displaced slowly. American Long Tom batteries, towed by M4 high-speed tractors, could displace, move 15 miles, and be ready to fire again faster than German batteries could complete a local displacement of 2 miles. This mobility gap compounded the range disadvantage. American artillery could shoot German guns from positions beyond counter-battery range, then displace before German forces could organize a response. The few occasions when German artillery did locate American Long Tom batteries, the American guns were usually gone by the time German fire missions arrived. Wehrmacht artillery officers in 1944 were fighting an opponent who could see further, shoot further, move faster, and fire more ammunition than German doctrine had prepared them to counter. The Battle of the Bulge in December 1944 and January 1945 demonstrated American artillery dominance in its most lethal form. On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 hours, 1,600 German artillery pieces unleashed a coordinated barrage across an 80-mile front. For 90 minutes, high explosive shells crashed into American positions. This was the opening act of Operation Wehrmacht am Rhein, Adolf Hitler's desperate final gamble to split the Allied armies and change the war's course. Over 410,000 German troops, supported by approximately 1,400 tanks and assault guns, began pushing through snow-covered forest against thinly held American lines. The initial German advance achieved tactical surprise. American forces facing this onslaught consisted of just 4 divisions spread across 80 miles. 2 divisions were green troops experiencing first combat. 2 others were veteran units recuperating from brutal fighting in the Hurtgen forest. Within hours, German spearheads had penetrated American lines and were driving west toward the Meuse River. But what German commanders did not anticipate was the response they would encounter once initial surprise wore off. Within hours of the breakthrough, American artillery began demonstrating capabilities that would fundamentally alter German assessments of the battle. Long-tom batteries, positioned in rear areas, began receiving fire missions. Corps artillery commanders coordinated fires from multiple battalions. The systematic destruction began. German columns advancing along narrow forest roads made perfect targets. Long-tom shells impacted with devastating precision. A single 95-pound high-explosive shell could destroy a half-track, disable a tank if it hit the right spot, or kill every man in a 20-yard radius. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But individual shells, however destructive, were not what broke German offensive momentum. It was the volume. Battery-level fire missions became battalion-level missions. Battalion missions became corps missions with dozens of long-tom batteries firing simultaneously. Time-on-target strikes delivered hundreds of shells within 3-second windows. German units attempting to advance found themselves in killing zones where escape was impossible and survival was luck. The shells came from directions German forward observers couldn't see. From ranges German artillery couldn't match. In volumes German logistics couldn't sustain if positions were reversed. By the second day of the Battle of the Bulge, American artillery had re-established communications networks disrupted by the initial German assault. Fire direction centers that had been knocked offline came back into operation. Corps artillery assets that had been supporting other sectors were redirected to the Ardennes. The weight of American firepower grew exponentially. By the third day, German advances were being contained by artillery fires that German forces could not suppress or avoid. By the end of the first week, German offensive momentum had stalled. German commanders who had planned Operation Wehrmacht am Rhein understood their fuel shortages were crippling. They knew Allied air superiority would become decisive once weather cleared. But what broke the offensives back before these factors could fully manifest was American artillery. Long-tom batteries, firing from positions 15 miles behind the front lines, could reach German assembly areas, supply routes, and command posts with systematic precision. German tactical innovations couldn't overcome this reality. When German forces concentrated for attacks, artillery dispersed them. When German forces dispersed to avoid artillery, they lacked concentration necessary for successful attacks. A Wehrmacht battalion commander interviewed after the war described the psychological impact. "We knew American artillery was good," he said. "We had faced it in Italy and France, but in the Ardennes it was different. The shells never stopped coming. We would dig in, prepare positions, plan our defense. Then the American artillery would find us. Not sporadic fire, sustained bombardment. 40 minutes, 50 minutes, an hour. Our positions would cease to exist. Our battalion would cease to exist as a fighting unit. And this happened not once, but repeatedly. We learned that American artillery could destroy us faster than we could reconstitute our units. This systematic destruction represented the true nature of American artillery superiority. It wasn't about individual gun performance, though the Long-Tom's capabilities were exceptional. It was about the system. Fire direction centers coordinating dozens of batteries. Forward observers in light aircraft calling fires within minutes of spotting targets. Ammunition supply that never faltered. Mobility that allowed rapid displacement and repositioning. Communications networks that functioned under combat conditions. And underlying everything, industrial capacity that produced unlimited shells, unlimited replacement barrels, unlimited powder charges. German artillery by late 1944 possessed none of these systemic advantages. Ammunition was rationed. Forward observers operated without adequate communications equipment. Mobility was limited by horse towing and unreliable vehicles. Fire direction remained decentralized, with batteries operating semi-independently rather than as integrated systems. The German army had entered World War II, believing that superior training and tactical excellence could offset material disadvantages. They learned through painful experience that industrial capacity systematically applied could overwhelm traditional military virtues. The effectiveness of long tom batteries in the latter stages of World War II can be measured in several ways. The most direct measurement is shells fired. In the European theatre, long tom battalions fired hundreds of thousands of rounds between June 1944 and May 1945. Exact figures vary by battalion and time period, but sustained rates of 30 to 40 rounds per gun per day were common during major operations. With 12 guns per battalion and 33 battalions in theatre, this represented over 12,000 rounds per day during peak operations. Each round delivered 95 pounds of high explosive to targets as far as 14 miles distant. The indirect measurements are equally telling. German after-action reports from late 1944 and early 1945 consistently cite American artillery as the primary factor limiting German tactical options. Commanders reported that movement in daylight invited immediate artillery fire. Assembly areas were struck before attacks could launch. Supply routes were interdicted by precisely targeted fires. Command posts were destroyed despite being positioned miles behind front lines. The long tom's extended range meant no position within the tactical depth of the battlefield was safe from American artillery. Wehrmacht veterans who survived the war's final year consistently described American artillery as the most terrifying aspect of combat. The psychological impact of being under sustained artillery fire, with no ability to respond effectively, created a sense of helplessness that eroded unit cohesion. German soldiers could fight against infantry attacks, they could engage tanks, they could defend against airstrikes by taking cover. But against American artillery, delivering time-on-target strikes from beyond visual range, there was nothing to fight against and nowhere to hide that was truly safe. The long tom's legacy extended far beyond World War II. The weapon remained in U.S. Army service through the Korean War, where its range and accuracy proved decisive in defensive battles. At Chipyongni in February 1951, long tom batteries delivered sustained fire that broke Chinese attacks on isolated American positions. The gun saw extensive service in Vietnam, where its ability to deliver fire support to remote fire bases kept isolated positions from being overrun. The Mohn, M1A1, and M2 variants remained in active service until the 1990s. Total production exceeded 10,000 weapons, a remarkable service record for a design that began as a stopgap replacement for World War I-era French guns. International adoption of the long tom demonstrated its effectiveness. The United Kingdom received 184 guns through Lend-Lease and continued using them in post-war armies. British artillery doctrine adapted to emphasize rapid, sustained fire, the core capability the long tom enabled. France received 25 guns. Nations including Austria, Israel, the Netherlands, Denmark, Greece, and Japan purchased long toms in the post-war period. Many remained in service through the 1970s and into the 1980s in some armies. The true legacy of the long tom, however, wasn't the weapon itself. It was the doctrine it enabled and the standard it established. Post-war artillery development worldwide adopted the principles American designers had built into the long tom. Extended range became mandatory. Rapid, sustained fire became the baseline expectation. Mobility and protection from counter-battery fire became design requirements. NATO standardization agreements in the 1950s explicitly adopted these principles. The benchmark rate for 150mm class howitzers became 4 rounds per minute sustained, with burst capability of 6 to 8 rounds. This wasn't arbitrary, it was the Long Tom standard, validated by 4 years of combat across every theatre. West Germany's rearmament after 1955 presented an particularly interesting case. When the Bundeswehr formed, former Wehrmacht officers were involved in planning. These men remembered the artillery gap all too well. The Bundeswehr didn't attempt to resurrect German World War II artillery designs or doctrine. Instead, they adopted American weapons and American training methods wholesale. Initial Bundeswehr artillery battalions, equipped with the M114 howitzer, purchased from U.S. surplus stocks. German crews trained at American artillery schools. They learned American fire direction procedures. They practiced American mass fire techniques. By the 1960s, when Germany began developing indigenous weapons like the FH-70 howitzer, the design requirements explicitly included sustained fire rates, matching or exceeding NATO standards. The FH-70 achieved 6 rounds per minute sustained, proving that German engineering could meet rapid-fire challenges when not constrained by outdated doctrine and wartime resource shortages. The circle had completed. German artillery in the Cold War was built around the same principles that the Long Tom had demonstrated in World War II. Extended range, rapid sustained fire, systematic coordination of mass fires. The Soviet Union drew similar conclusions from studying captured German reports and their own experience with Lend-Lease artillery. American guns had flowed to the Red Army through Lend-Lease, though in smaller numbers than the tanks and trucks that received more attention. Soviet artillery officers, who used American weapons, recognized their capabilities. Post-war Soviet howitzer development prioritized rate of fire alongside range and shell weight. The D-20, entering service in 1955, could sustain 5 to 6 rounds per minute, comparable to Western guns and far exceeding anything Germany had fielded in World War II. Soviet artillery doctrine evolved to emphasize overwhelming firepower, delivered rapidly, the same principle American gunners had demonstrated from Normandy to the Elbe. The Red Army's experience receiving and using American artillery through Lend-Lease had convinced Soviet planners that rate of fire was a strategic capability, not merely a technical specification. The lessons from that December morning in the Ardennes, when a Wehrmacht battalion commander watched his positions systematically destroyed by shells from guns he couldn't locate or counter, became foundational principles for Cold War artillery doctrine on both sides of the Iron Curtain. Modern artillery has moved far beyond towed howitzers to self-propelled systems with automated loading, digital fire control, and even more impressive rates of fire. The M109 Paladin can fire 4 rounds in under 1 minute, then displace before counter-battery fire arrives. The German PEDS H2000 can fire 10 rounds in less than 60 seconds using burst fire modes that would have seemed impossible to World War II gunners. These capabilities trace directly back to the revelation that rate of fire and volume of fire matter more than incremental improvements in accuracy or range. The Wehrmacht never expected the Long Tom to fire 14 miles and obliterate entire battalions because German doctrine didn't conceive of artillery operating at such ranges with such sustained volume. German artillery thinking remained rooted in World War I principles, where guns fired from positions close to the front and emphasized precision over speed. The Long Tom represented a different philosophy entirely. Position artillery beyond enemy counter-battery range, coordinate fires from multiple batteries through centralized fire direction, deliver overwhelming volumes of fire that enemy forces cannot survive or counter, sustain operations through industrial logistics that treat ammunition as an unlimited resource. That German officer standing in a frozen Ardennes forest in December 1944, watching his battalion disappear under sustained bombardment from guns positioned beyond his artillery's range, was witnessing the future of ground warfare. The future belonged to systems that integrated firepower, communications, logistics, and mobility into coordinated capability that exceeded the sum of individual components. The future belonged to industrial powers that could produce unlimited ammunition and the doctrine to employ it decisively. The future did not belong to armies built around individual excellence and tactical brilliance, no matter how thoroughly those armies had mastered the previous war's lessons. The Long Tom fired its shells across distances that German artillery couldn't match, and delivered volumes that German logistics couldn't sustain. In doing so, it demonstrated that modern warfare rewards systematic excellence over individual skill, industrial capacity over warrior spirit, and coordinated firepower over tactical innovation. The metal and hydraulics of the 155mm gun moan were impressive engineering, but the real revolution was conceptual. American artillery doctrine had evolved beyond the constraints that limited German thinking. The Long Tom was simply the physical expression of that evolution. Wehrmacht officers who survived encounters with American Long Tom batteries returned to Germany with stories that seemed impossible to soldiers who hadn't experienced it. Artillery that fired from position you couldn't see. Barrages that lasted not minutes but hours. Shells that kept coming regardless of weather, regardless of time, regardless of terrain, and, above all, the crushing realization that your own artillery couldn't respond because the American guns were positioned beyond your maximum range. These stories, compiled in after-action reports and prisoner interrogations, painted a picture of systematic superiority that German military tradition had no framework to process. The German army had built its reputation on superior training, aggressive tactics, and battlefield excellence. These virtues had served Germany well in the war's early years, but by 1945 they proved insufficient against an enemy who had converted industrial capacity into overwhelming military capability. The Long Tom batteries that destroyed Wehrmacht battalions from 14 miles away were symbols of this transformation. They represented factory production converted to military purpose. They demonstrated that systematic organization applied to destruction could overcome any amount of tactical skill. When German officers said the war was over after experiencing American artillery in its full systematic fury, they spoke literal truth. The war had been over from the moment American industrial capacity fully mobilized and applied itself to European combat. The Long Tom simply made this truth undeniable. A weapon system that outranged, outfired, and outlasted anything Germany could field, demonstrated that the era of tactical excellence deciding battles had ended. Modern industrial warfare required different virtues: production capacity, logistical sophistication, systematic organization, unlimited resources applied intelligently. The 155mm gun moan served American armed forces for over 50 years. It fought in 3 major wars and numerous smaller conflicts. Thousands were produced. Hundreds remain in museums and war memorials worldwide. The weapon earned its place in history through reliable performance under combat conditions across every conceivable terrain and climate. But its most important contribution wasn't longevity or reliability. It was demonstrating that artillery could be decisive when employed as an integrated system with sufficient range, sufficient volume, and sufficient logistical support. The Wehrmacht learned this lesson too late and at devastating cost. American Long Toms, firing from positions beyond German artillery range, obliterated battalions because German doctrine had no counter to systematic firepower delivered at such scale. The shells that rained down on Wehrmacht positions in the Ardennes and across Germany in early 1945 were more than high-explosive projectiles. They were the sound of industrial civilization at war, the death knell of military traditions built around individual excellence. The proof that in modern warfare, the side with superior systems defeats the side with superior soldiers. The story of the Long Tom does not end with victory in Europe, or even with the weapon's retirement from active service. It extends into the fundamental transformation of how modern militaries conceive of artillery power. The lessons learned from this weapon system continue to influence doctrine, procurement decisions, and tactical thinking more than 80 years after its introduction. Consider the evolution of counter-battery warfare. Before the Long Tom demonstrated the tactical advantage of extended range, artillery duels occurred between opponents positioned at roughly equivalent distances from the front lines. Both sides could observe, locate, and engage enemy batteries. This created a tactical equilibrium where skill, preparation, and luck determined outcomes. The Long Tom shattered this equilibrium permanently. Once one side possessed artillery that could engage from beyond the enemy's maximum range, counter-battery warfare became asymmetric. The side with longer range could systematically destroy enemy artillery while remaining invulnerable to return fire. This capability fundamentally altered military planning. Artillery was no longer merely a supporting arm that provided fires when infantry needed them. It became a weapon that could achieve strategic effects independently. Long Tom batteries in World War II destroyed German logistics nodes, command posts, and assembly areas without requiring infantry or armor to close with the enemy. This independent strategic effect represented a revolution in artillery employment. The gun had evolved from a tactical support weapon into a strategic asset capable of influencing operations across entire sectors of front. Modern militaries have internalized this lesson completely. Contemporary artillery development focuses obsessively on range extension, rocket-assisted projectiles, extended-range full-bore ammunition, gun-launched guided munitions. Every advancement aims to push engagement ranges further, creating larger asymmetries between opposing artillery systems. The U.S. Army's Extended Range Cannon Artillery program seeks to achieve ranges exceeding 70 kilometers. The reasoning traces directly to Long Tom employment in 1944 and 1945. The side that can shoot further controls the artillery battle. The side that controls the artillery battle controls the ground battle. The organizational lessons from Long Tom employment proved equally influential. The weapon was not a divisional asset. It belonged to corps-level artillery, deployed where senior commanders needed decisive firepower. This organizational structure reflected a sophisticated understanding of how to employ limited numbers of high-capability weapons. Rather than distributing Long Tom batteries to every division, where they might sit idle during quiet periods, corps commanders could mass these weapons at critical points. 6 or 8 Long Tom battalions could be concentrated to support a major offensive, delivering overwhelming firepower that no single division could generate independently. This flexible employment model became standard for subsequent high-capability systems. Modern rocket artillery, like the M270 multiple-launch rocket system, operates under similar organizational principles. MLRS battalions are brigade and division assets that can be task-organized to support specific operations. The reasoning mirrors Long Tom employment. High capability, limited availability systems should be controlled at levels where commanders can employ them decisively rather than dispersed to units that might use them inefficiently. The Fire Direction Center concept that enabled Long Tom effectiveness represented another enduring innovation. Before centralized fire direction, artillery batteries operated semi-independently. Battery commanders received fire missions, calculated firing data, and engaged targets based on local information. This decentralized approach worked adequately when missions were simple and targets were close, but it could not coordinate the complex, multi-battery missions that characterized American artillery operations by 1944. Fire direction centers changed everything. A single headquarters could coordinate fires from dozens of batteries scattered across miles of front. Calculations accounted for each battery's position, each gun's individual characteristics, meteorological conditions at different locations, and the precise timing needed to achieve simultaneous impact. This centralization allowed American artillery to execute time-on-target missions that German observers initially attributed to impossible luck rather than systematic capability. The Fire Direction Center concept proved so effective that every modern artillery system incorporates some version of it. Digital fire control systems in contemporary artillery are direct descendants of the manual fire direction centers that coordinated Long Tom fires in World War II. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.